right, welcome to More Devoted, where faith grows deeper. My name's Ryan Perry.
I'm Christopher Hulsey.
And we are pastors here at Seneca Baptist Church, and this podcast is a ministry of Seneca Baptist Church. So today, we've got a new topic. What is it, Christopher?
So this past Sunday, you talked about our second pillar of multi-generational family. So today we're going to dive into what that means. And so do you think, my first question I have for you is, are there any sort of cultural issues we're dealing with right now in our world when it comes to the word family?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation about the impact that fathers or fatherlessness has had on a generation. And so like you can literally find teaching, and I'm not saying it's good teaching, it's actually really poor teaching that is trying to belittle the idea of family in the Bible. Don't use, if calling God your father is harmful to you, refer to him as some other gender or something else. And so instead of redeeming what the Bible teaches by having biblical authority, like we talked about last week, let's just throw it away. And so not to degrade the hurt that people have had.
Right.
But God the Father is unlike any shortcomings that any of our earthly fathers have ever had.
Right.
And so instead of imposing those on him, yes, we need to redeem the picture of God the Father. Yeah. And so I think that kind of plays out in a number of different ways, but that's how it's viewed.
Yeah, that's good. So we're going to do some deep dive into your sermon on Sunday.
All right.
And one of the first points you made was that God's family starts with adoption. And it was great. And I just want to deep dive again. So you mentioned that as adopted sons, and you specifically said sons. So address that in a second, why you said sons and not daughters. But you mentioned that as adopted sons of God, we are not just saved from something, but into something. Can you give us a quick dive into what the from something to into really means?
Right. So most of the time we focus on one of the two things, right? And what we typically focus on is, well, I don't have to go to hell now. So I'm saved from hell. I'm saved from my sin. I'm saved from punishment. I'm saved from those things.
Right.
And so like that's the typical way we view it. But not only are we saved from hell, we're saved into heaven. We're saved from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of God's beloved Son, out of slavery into the family. We're saved from something into something, out of God's wrath into God's favor.
Right.
And so the Bible speaks of it that way. And so that's what I mean by that. And when we talk about adoption, we're saved into God's family by grace.
Right.
And the way that God does that, all right, so you know, and maybe if you're watching this or listening to this, you don't know, but our first son, Miles, is adopted. Right. And so I think about it this way. How many years ago? 12 years ago, basically, we traveled to a country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, South Pacific, and we met Miles. We got to hold Miles for the first time. We'd never laid eyes on him other than pictures. We'd never spoken to him, but we got to meet him. We got to hold him. And that day he became ours.
Right.
And no longer was he an orphan. There's one less orphan in the world. And so that day Miles became a part of our family. He took our last name and he had a new future and a new life because he was adopted into a new family.
Right.
And so in the same way, God the Father traveled a really long way. And he didn't travel to the South Pacific. He left heaven, came to earth to purchase back those rebellious children or rebellious creation and make them children in the family of God. And he did that through the blood of his own son, Jesus. And so, we think about on the cross, the Son of God says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And as Tim Keller reminds us so well, God forsook his only son, Jesus, so that he could bring us into the family.
It's so beautiful.
And so that's
Yeah.
what adoption is. He does that through grace,
Yeah.
and he calls us sons. You mentioned the sons in Galatians 4:7, so that we may be sons, and if we're sons, then heirs.
Right.
And so every one of us, whether we're male or female, are now equal standing with the very Son of God.
Yeah.
And we have equal standing in that inheritance. So it's just a most amazing picture of God's grace.
It is pretty awesome. So our pillar this week is multi-generational family. And so you talked about, how the start of family is through adoption. And then we're trying to break down this theme with our pillar. And the first part of that is the word multi-generational. And so when we're reading through the book of Acts, we see a picture of the church. And when we look there, we see young people all the way up to widows, families and singles, the rich and the poor. How do you see that carried out in our pillar of multi-generational family here at Seneca Baptist?
Right. So, everybody celebrates when a baby's born. Like, that's a good day. And so we need the baby. We need the crying baby in our nursery. We need the young family, but we also need the wisdom of the gray hair.
Yeah.
And those of you who are well endowed with age, you've got many years, you have resources and wisdom that you can bless your church with and lead, and you can become surrogate grandparents and surrogate parents,
Right.
To families who need help, and most young families sure need help. You can become that. So we see that we need all generations,
Sure.
not just one of them.
You said it in a fun way on Sunday. You said caring for the people from the womb to the tomb.
That's right.
And I've heard that over and over from you. So
yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Life matters. And so in the Bible, you see the first argument in the church is Acts chapter 6, and it's widows who are arguing with one another. And so the church was seeking to care for widows really well. And James reminds us in James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God is this, to look after orphans and widows in their time of distress. And so James doesn't say, hey, it's about this generation or it's about that generation, but it's every generation, multi-generations that we need to take care of.
That's pretty cool. So another topic you hit on with this theme of multi-generation was actually about worship. And so I personally love how we do worship here. It's different at Seneca Baptist, and we keep the family unit together for the singing and the prayer portion of our service. And we don't send them out until right before your message.
And that's like super countercultural, right?
It is
in the church right now.
And so, how do you explain to a family that's looking for a church why the way we do it here, it is different, but why is it also so beautiful?
All right, so it would probably be much easier. Like, we could admit that it would be easier that at the very beginning of service, you put the kids in nursery or kids worship, or like, we've got a space just for you. That would be easier. And parents might feel like I'm gonna put it in quotation marks, like they get more out of service and the kids get more out of service.
Sure.
And there is some truth to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we feel like the more beautiful way is for a child to squirm on the pew, and for a parent to have a discipleship opportunity in the pew to train that child. This is how mama and daddy worship.
Right.
This is how we give our offerings. This is how we tithe. This is how we sing. This is what we do with our hands. This is what we do when we're listening to a sermon, rather than you go to your own spot and we go to our own spot. So what I'm not saying is that we do it right and everybody else does it wrong.
Sure.
But we're willing to sacrifice something here for what we think is good here. And so we do it that way with intention and purpose.
And we even go as far as to make it age range. So like second grade and under are the ones that get to go out. Because, we believe that once you get to third grade, you should be able to handle,
of course
an hour service. And they sit through classes all day at school, and
they can do it.
They can do it. It's great.
And parents, if you're out there and you're going, I don't know if I can do it, you can do it.
Yeah.
Like you can. And we're here to help people do it. And so like even at our welcome center, we've got some little gift bags or bags for
Yeah.
kids if they're going to struggle.
Yeah.
Here's something that they can do and doodle with, because we know that even if we might not have their eyes, we have their ears.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. So kind of leads into my next little thing I want to talk about. So it is definitely God's design for the generations that we all be together.
Right.
So like Psalm 145 verse 4 says, one generation shall commend your works to another. And then you see it again in 2 Timothy 2 verse 2. And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to the faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So it talks about how they're carrying down that,
That's right.
that generational knowledge.
I
and
mean,
stuff.
even in that 2 Timothy 2:2, there's 4 generations.
Right.
And when we think about our worship service, that's what it should be.
Sure.
So one generation should literally be hearing from another generation the works of God. And the younger generation should be looking to the older generation going, I want to be like that when I grow up. And so that the older generations need to become the models of Christianity for the generations they're following.
Yeah. So we say this a good bit, that God has called our older generation to invest in our younger generation. Right. And so some of the things we do here at Seneca Baptist that might not be happening at other churches in our area or around the country is that we truly believe in teaching and training children. And so we have a preschool for
Right.
our child development center preschool. And we have a partnership with Seneca Classical Academy that goes kindergarten through 12th grade. So any given day when the school year is happening, we could have nearly 450 kids here, not only learning about math and English and
ABCs,
all the
right?
things, but they're learning about Jesus.
Right.
And so tell us why that fulfills not only this pillar, but how it also speaks to our vision of this church.
So I'll be honest, right? You know, but we've had pushback on that.
Sure.
Over the years, and people go, well, I don't know how it fits into the ministry of our church. Like, how's it going to bless our church? And I think that's asking the wrong question.
Right.
The question is not how's it going to bless our church, but how's it going to impact the kingdom?
Sure.
Right. So we've got to get out of what's it do for Seneca Baptist.
Yeah.
And we've got to get into the mindset of there is a kingdom that exists outside of Seneca Baptist, and we are helping form the faith of the coming generation that's going to follow Jesus. And they might not follow Jesus at Seneca Baptist, but they will follow Jesus somewhere.
Right.
They might become pastors or missionaries or doctors or the next, politician who's going to follow Jesus in that field, be mamas and daddies who love Christ and are raising up their children to know Jesus. And we get to invest in that way.
Right.
So to say, well, we're not going to do it because it's not going to be a blessing to Seneca Baptist is a very narrow-minded and short-sighted way to look at it. So we just try to look at it with a big picture and go, man, you get to teach them every week what worship looks like.
Right.
And I get to invest in high school guys' chapel.
Right.
And so we're pouring into them what it means to be a follower of Christ, what it means to worship him and give our lives to him.
Yeah.
And that is investment.
So that is pretty awesome. So kind of wrapping up this multi-generational thing, we see that every age group brings something essential to the church.
Right.
So, the young bring the life and the energy and the vitality and all those things. And then we have the mature wisdom and leadership and resources from other generations. And it's beautiful to see how it all works together.
It works that way in a family, in a home.
Right.
And it ought to work that way in God's family.
Yeah. So that cues us right into the second word in this pillar is family. So you had made the point that a family is built on grace. So try to explain a little bit for our audience. What does that mean to be a family built on grace?
So in my own house, in your house, we don't expect the same thing out of our children that we might expect out of our spouses, right?
Right.
As our children age, we expect more of them. We're training them. And we're in our homes, right? You're giving your kids chores. I'm giving mine chores. Why? Because we want them to become responsible little human beings
Right.
and those who invest in their home. So Miles starts mowing the grass. I do not expect that Miles is going to mow the grass like I mow the grass
Right.
because I've been doing it for 25 years or
Right.
30 years or whatever it is. And so he's going to mess up. He's going to cut my flowers down with a weed eater, right? He's
Yep.
going to do these things. And I have two responses. I can blow up, get angry, how my child who's just learning a trait um, is not doing it the right way. Or I can go, hey, great job. Next time, let's do that different. And so grace is treating people the way that they don't deserve to be treated. Giving grace is this idea of they're going to mess up, we're going to fall short, we're going to hurt one another, we're going to let each other down, but knowing that we're all works in progress. None of us have made it, none of us have it all together, but we're all pressing forward to the goal of Jesus. And so let's
Yeah.
be kind to each other.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've learned really well from you is your ability to give grace so beautifully. And I think that we've said before our personalities are different, and I'm learning that I need to be able to give more grace, and it's beautiful to see that in your leadership. And so, good
Well,
job,
thanks,
bud.
man.
All right, so we talk about grace, which is great, but we also talked about how a family, a real family, will fight for one another. And so that next point that you discussed in your sermon on Sunday is that we should fight for one another. And so how does that work in a church when culturally we're saturated with a hypercritical world? Or
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the word you're about to say is cynical.
Yeah.
And we live in that world where it's really easy to sit behind a computer screen on a phone and look at the faults of other people and
Sure.
kind of call them out. And we find it okay in this world we live in to do that in groups of people. And that has come into the church. The news media does it. Everybody's pointing out everybody else's faults. And if we're going to be a family, that means we've got to welcome the broken, welcome the hurting, welcome those who are struggling in marriage or struggling in parenting or whatever it is. We've got to be welcoming to them. And instead of thinking about that person as my enemy, I've got to fight for them rather than against them. And so we've got to do that. We don't need to talk about one another, but we've got to learn to talk to each other.
Yeah, that's good. So you had mentioned that you had found an article from Chris Kane, which is a guy out of Birmingham Baptist Association, that he talked about the sources of conflict,
right?
Specifically in the church. And those were pride, spiritual and emotional immaturity, change and inflexibility, politics, like church politics,
Yep.
Unclear authority, differences in personalities, or abuses of power. I know this is a tough topic, but how have you seen that play out in the church over the years, and how are we working through that?
Well, I mean, I see pride in my own life a good bit, where I think that I'm the one who, if I don't do it, then it's going to fall apart, right? Or I do it independently of God. But I hear people say stuff like, "Well, that's my classroom."
Mm-hmm.
That's pride, right? This isn't ours. I hear, this is the way we do it at my church.
Right.
Well, it's not your church; it's Christ's church. So those are all things of pride, and from pride, we often, I think, spiritual and emotional immaturity are revealed.
Right.
We see that come to the surface in conflict.
Yep.
When all things are going well, you don't see pride come to the surface. You don't see immaturity come to the surface, but in those conflicts, you see those things come up. Change, two things, I've heard it said, two things Baptists don't like: change and the same old thing. right?
That's the truth.
So nobody wants to keep doing the same thing, but nobody really wants to be a change agent. We're creatures of habit. So
Yeah.
lots of different ways. And it comes down to ends with abuses of power.
Right.
And we've just got to acknowledge, like in our own denomination, and even in our own churches, there have been times where those that we've looked up to in leadership have failed us,
Right.
or use their authority, their God-given authority, in ungodly ways. And so that often brings conflict. So we've just got to recognize that, admit that, and any pastor in any position is tempted to do so.
Yeah. It's hard to deal with, a hard conversation to have, but it's much needed. Can you walk us through? You walk through the Matthew chapter 5 passage. Could you kind of explain that to us again a little bit?
So we talked about how to handle conflict, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about. Matthew 18 is, and I'll come to Matthew 5 in a minute, but Matthew 18 is that passage about church. We call it church discipline.
Sure.
And that does not sound like a fun term. And if you
No.
go back to abuses of power,
Right.
it gets really gray and fuzzy, and
Sure.
it has been used incorrectly.
Right. And that's probably why churches don't like that term.
100%.
They've thrown it out.
Church discipline equals you're gone. We don't like you. You don't agree with us. So it's
Right.
easier to just have you out than it is to try to work with you and help us all grow together.
Sure.
And so Matthew 18, if your brother sins against you, go to him in private. And it says, if he listens, you've won your brother. And that's the heart behind church discipline.
Right.
Is to win a brother and to restore and reconcile a relationship. Then it says, if he doesn't listen to you, you take a witness with you. And if he listens, you won your brother. And if he doesn't listen to the both of you, or the you and the witness, you take him before the church. And I don't think that means you bring them before every member in the whole church.
At a business meeting?
Yeah, no, don't do that.
Mm-mm.
I believe what it means is you take them to the leaders of the church, those pastor leaders inside the church, pastor, elder, overseer, whatever you want to call them. And it's those people who lead the church who get to plead one more time,
right,
with this wayward brother and say, come back.
Yeah.
And
for the purpose of restoration. That's what all of this is about.
Galatians 6:2 says, if anyone among you stumbles, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness. And that's the idea, restore them with gentleness. And so behind that, Matt, you brought up Matthew 5. It's the idea of blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful. And then blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God.
Right.
And so in the middle of all that, that's how we handle church conflict. And there's some bad ways to handle it too.
So in that Matthew 5 reference, and I caught it on Sunday, you mentioned blessed are the peacemakers. And that reminded me of a book I've read recently by Ken Sand, and it's called The Peacemaker. And he provides what I think is a very helpful framework of how to respond to conflict. And in this book, it really does a really good job of explaining that the churches have lost sight of their original text when it comes to the word peacemaker. And so he puts them in 3 different categories to kind of help us understand what peacemaking really is. And there's 3 types of people, or 3 types of responses or responders. There's the peacemaker, the peace faker, and then the peace breaker. So the peacemaker is biblical and it's gospel driven. Right. So the purpose of restoration, all that kind of stuff falls into that. They pursue the confession, they pursue forgiveness, and they ultimately pursue restoration. So that's a peacemaker. One of the things I think that churches in general fall into maybe this second category, which what he calls the peace faker, which avoids conflict at all costs. Now, unless you're a person that just likes conflict, then
which if you are, then be afraid of that person.
Yeah, exactly. So the peace faker pretends that everything is fine, they suppress, they deny the conflict, and they avoid dealing with the problems.
Just sweep it under the rug.
Yep, sweep it under the rug. So they minimize and ignore issues because, more importantly than anything, they've got to keep the calm.
Keep the peace. Make sure everybody's happy.
Make sure everybody's happy.
It's like the Love Boat mentality. You were a big cruise ship. Make sure everybody's happy.
Everybody's happy all the time.
Right.
So, and the final thing he talks about is a peace breaker. And this is a person that escalates the conflict sinfully. And I wouldn't say that the church, like leadership in churches, try to do this, but maybe individuals have fallen for this before, but that the peace breaker reacts to conflict with aggression, or they have a sense of control. Right. Goes back to that pride thing, or even they want vengeance. Like, this is mine. How dare you take it away from me? So I'm going to get rid of you.
Yeah.
So ultimately, they're willing to damage relationships in order to win their side of the argument. So you have three types: peacemaker, peace faker, and peace breaker. Now, we've had this conversation before about our own tendencies in this area. Yeah. And I'll be the first to admit that, my tendency without the Lord's blessing is that peace breaker. I mean, when somebody does me wrong, I want to call them out.
Right.
And, being in ministry, you learn real quick that doesn't work.
And I'm a peace faker. Right. I want everybody to be happy. I want to kind of minimize the bad. I want to amplify the good. Yeah. And so we all fall into different ditches. Sure. Right. And I think those are beautiful categories that he talks about.
It's pretty cool. And so it just reminds us that we get back to that, the original meaning of the word peace, shalom. It's a holistic form of peace. It's not about that conflict is not going to exist.
That's right.
It's about living with people in a state of peace, which is ultimately the goal. So
that's right.
It's pretty cool. So in your sermon, after you kind of went through the blessed or the peacemaker thing, you talked about how a church, and specifically a multi-generational family in a church, they have to choose to trust.
Right.
To be a good family, they have to choose to trust. I think that maybe a question might have come from that sermon is, you say that, but what if my situation's different? And so we see what the scripture says about, trusting people, but what if the person that's done you wrong is not willing to A, admit they're wrong, or B, have any desire towards restoration?
All right. So I'm going to use a silly illustration because by God's grace, we have had really faithful people when it comes to our finances. Okay. So, yeah. But my silly illustration is, let's say we have somebody who's dealing with our finances at Seneca Baptist Church. They steal money from the church, and they're caught stealing money from the church. And even if hypothetically speaking, they come back and say, yep, Ryan, you know what? Messed up. That was my bad. I did that. I stole money. And here it is back. I'll restore it back. Does that mean you put them in charge of finances again?
Nope.
And the answer is no, right? So what I'm intending to get at is not that for the unrepentant person that you immediately just trust them, because I think trust and repentance go hand in hand.
Right.
The more someone is willing to acknowledge their fault and work on restoring what they've done, being reconciled to the one they've hurt, the more you're willing to trust that person. And it's hard to have a strong relationship with somebody that's not admitted that.
Right.
But what I'm trying to, I think, get at with this idea of we choose trust is that ought to be our go-to rather than the attitudes of cynicism or questioning everybody's motives,
right,
and wondering why is he doing that or whatever. That we're choosing to trust the intentions and motivations of people rather than to assign to them evil ones.
Right. That's great. So one of the last points you had in your message on Sunday was that a family takes responsibility for one
Right.
another. Give us a few examples of what that means specifically for Seneca Baptist about taking responsibility.
So here at Seneca Baptist, we operate differently when it comes to caring for people.
Hmm.
So there's 2 pastors on staff, and we're not a huge church, but we can't take care of every person's physical needs. And so we do that through our deacons, which are servants here at Seneca Baptist, and we do that through our Sunday school classes.
Right.
Which means that if there's somebody sick in your Sunday school class, your first response is not to tell the pastor, but your first response is to meet that need.
Mm.
If they're in your class, you are your brother's keeper.
Right.
And if you can't meet that need, upgrade that need to your deacon. And if your deacon can't meet that need, upgrade that need to your pastor.
Yeah.
And it's just like in Acts chapter 6, that the apostles were like, hey, we're so busy with caring for the widow and the food that we don't have time to devote ourselves to the ministry of the word and prayer.
Right.
And so the very things that God's called us to do, we can't do. And so we at Seneca Baptist, we take responsibility for one another by caring for them.
That's great. So that's the care of our brothers and sisters in Christ.
Right.
Another point you brought up was the care, taking responsibility for the house.
Right.
And this is fun, but like we have a big building here.
Yes, we do.
And so
80,000 square feet.
Yeah. And so what does that mean when we say that our family takes responsibility when it comes to the house?
Well, in your house and mine, I'm sure everybody's assigned some chores.
Sure.
Right. And so our life goes better when we don't have to clean up everything as parents.
Sure.
And so I guess it goes a couple ways, right? In the house, the building of Seneca Baptist, if you see a need, work on fixing that need.
Right.
I use this on Sunday morning. I don't go in the women's restroom.
What?
And praise God, right?
I'm glad you don't.
I ought not go in there.
Yeah.
And so, but don't come to me and tell me that the toilet is clogged, right? Take care of that need. If there's no toilet paper, let's get that taken care of.
Sure.
If there's a mess, don't walk past the mess. Take responsibility for it. And there's also the financial part of it.
Right.
When my children grow into maturity and they graduate from high school, begin to move out of the house, they're going to be given more responsibility for the financial needs that they have.
Right. And
so in a home, you want your children to move from being consumers of the resources to producers of the resources. Right. And not in a consumeristic way, our culture looks at the church and says, what can the church do for me? And we've got to move people from being consumers, individualistic mentalities, right, to being producers. It's about the good of the family. So what can I do to produce for the church? So financially and in service and all those different ways.
Yeah. And you kind of rounded off your sermon by acknowledging that we are multi-generational, but we take responsibility for the next generation.
Right.
So how are we doing that? How are we striving to make that better? Tell us a little bit about the next generation at Seneca Baptist.
Well, 9 years ago, my first weekend of being the pastor at Seneca Baptist, I stood up and said, if we don't do something to reach the next generation, we will close our door in a decade.
Right.
And we had 0 children other than the ones that the staff brought to the church, right? And so that means you've got to prioritize the next generation. Now, that doesn't mean you don't care for every generation, but we've got to prioritize the coming one. And so we've always got to be forward thinking, forward leaning. Now, that does not mean we throw away the old gospel message. No, that we are under biblical authority. So God's biblical gospel message cannot be changed or altered in any way. But almost every method can. And so we've got to be forward thinking in our music, our programming. We don't do it just because we've always done it. We do it what meets the needs of disciple making for this generation. How can we reach more families? How can we impact more families? And so we've got to be thinking about the next generation.
Yeah. So that's great. So we hope that these podcasts are helpful and going through
We sure do.
and deep diving into what these pillars are. And so this was the one on multi-generational family. Next week, we're going to hit the topic of transformational discipleship.
Yeah.
So
It's exciting.
Keyword being transformational, because the discipleship word is a hot topic word in churches. So can you give us a quick take on what to expect this coming Sunday?
Yeah, we're going to define what discipleship is with a clear, concise definition. And then we're going to talk about how discipleship has got to move past information to transformation.
Yes.
So if discipleship is not changing our lives and making us mature followers of Jesus, then that's actually not discipleship. Discipleship cannot end with knowledge or Bible study, but it's got to end with application. And ultimately, a true disciple of Jesus makes disciples of others.
Right. So you're going to really mess with a lot of Baptists, I'm thinking, this weekend.
If I'm doing well, we'll see.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Well, that concludes our podcast for today. And so we'll see you all next week.
Thanks for watching More Devoted. God bless you.